Well, good evening, folks. Hope you've had a wonderful day. And I just felt like that I needed to respond to this video that Stephen Whitsett has posted below my latest video, where I'm debunking the typical objections that are raised against realized eschatology. And in the introduction to that video, I pointed out that all of these objections that are raised against covenant eschatology are just the typical eisegetical, presuppositional objections, and that they are raised consistently. But anyway, this seems to have ruffled Stephen's feathers just a little bit, and he felt the need to respond, and even calling me onion, which that's fine. That's actually a pretty good phonetic there to help you understand how to correctly pronounce my name. Run, yun, onion. So okay, it's fine. And he's no doubt just being a little lighthearted there, and that's fine. But in this video, Stephen has made basically three arguments or three objections or assertions, and these are that number one, preterism just can't be right. It just can't be, because it was only invented back in the 60s, 1960s. And it can't be. It just can't be right. And then the second argument is that when Jesus said, "All things are written, these be the days of vengeance, in which all things that are written will be fulfilled," there in Luke 21:22, that this is not referring to all prophecy that is written, but only to the things prophesied regarding the days of vengeance. And then the third objection that he has raised here, the third argument, is that the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, in the predictions there of Daniel 7, is referring to his ascension. And then he made a little ancillary argument that the parousia of Christ is not the second coming, but rather just means that Christ, Jesus, that he would just send judgment. That is not the second coming. So those are the basic three arguments that he has made in this video, with the one ancillary argument there about the parousia. So I want to deal with the first argument that he made here, and that is that preterism just can't be right, because it was just invented as early as back in the 1960s. And he made the statement in the video that I'm presenting something that has never ever been before. And he went on to say that you'd think that if this were true, then there would have been shades of that going on since the beginning of the church, and it's simply not true. And this was around the 2-minute mark and following, right in that area there. If you've watched the video, then you're familiar with it. But anyway, like I said, I wanted to address this first argument. There's no way that, I could, but I'm not going to take the time this late this evening to address everything that needs to be talked about and addressed in his video. But I want to talk about this first argument here, that preterism just can't be right because it's only invented back in the 1960s. Well, Stephen, I'd like to take you back to the 17th century. Somehow I think you know this, which gives me pause in the things that you're bringing up here. But anyway, I want to take you back to the 17th century and a man by the name of John Lightfoot, and some of the things that he wrote. Okay, he wrote, and I'm going to be reading several things here as we consider some of his writing in the 17th century now. Okay, now he says that the destruction of Jerusalem and the whole Jewish state is described as if the whole frame of this world were to be dissolved. Nor is it strange when God destroyed his habitation and city, places once so dear to him, with so direful and sad an overthrow. His own people, whom he accounted of as much more than the whole world beside, by so dreadful and amazing plagues. Matthew 24:29 and 30. The sun shall be darkened, and following. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man, and following, which yet are said to fall out within that generation, verse 34. 2 Peter 3:10, the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and following. Compare with this Deuteronomy 32:22, Hebrews 12:26, and observe that by elements are understood the Mosaic elements, Galatians 4:9, Colossians 2:20, and you will not doubt that St. Peter speaks only of the conflagration of Jerusalem, the destruction of the nation, and the abolishing of the dispensation of Moses. I continue. With the same reference, it is that the times and state of things immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem are called a new creation, new heavens, a new earth, Isaiah 65:17. Behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth. When should that be? Read the whole chapter and you will find the Jews rejected and cut off. And now notice this. And from that time is that new creation of the evangelical world among the Gentiles. Compare 2 Corinthians 5:17 and Revelation 21:1 and 2, where the old Jerusalem being cut off and destroyed, a new one succeeds, and new heavens and a new earth are created. 2 Peter 3:13, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth. The heavens and the earth of the Jewish church and commonwealth must be all on fire and the Mosaic elements burn up. But we, according to the promise made to us by Isaiah the prophet, when all these are consumed, look for the new creation of the evangelical state. The day, the time, and the manner of the execution of this vengeance upon this people are called the day of the Lord, the day of Christ, his coming in the clouds, in his glory, in his kingdom. Of Acts 2 and verse 20, he writes, before the great and notable day of the Lord come. Let us take notice how St. Peter applies that prophecy of Joel to those very times, and it will be clear enough without any commentary what that day of the Lord is. 2 Thessalonians 2:2, as if the day of Christ was at hand, and following. To this also do those passages belong. Hebrews 10:37, yet a little while, and he that shall come will come. James 5 and verse 9, behold, the judge is at the door. Revelation 1 verse 7, he cometh in the clouds. And 22:12, that's Revelation 22:12, behold, I come quickly. With many other passages of that nature, all which must be understood of Christ's coming in judgment and vengeance against that wicked nation. And in this very sense must the words now before us be taken, and no otherwise. Again, this is John Lightfoot writing in the 17th century, Stephen. But let's continue. John Lightfoot in the 17th century said this on Acts 1 and verse 11. Then shall the Son of Man give proof of himself, whom they would not before acknowledge, a proof indeed not in any visible figure, not in any visible figure, but in vengeance and judgment so visible that all the tribes of the earth shall be forced to acknowledge him, the avenger. Kenneth Gentry said of Lightfoot, quote, Lightfoot even adopted the view that Revelation 1:7 speaks of Christ taking vengeance on that exceeding wicked nation of Israel. There he interpreted Christ's coming as a providential judgment upon those who pierced him, the Jews. From among all the tribes of the land, literally Israel, this committed Lightfoot so strongly to preterism that he suggested Revelation's overall theme is Israel's judgment. I may further add that perhaps this observation might not a little help, if my eyes fail me not, in discovering the method of the author of the book of Revelation. This led him to conclude that the judiciary scene set up in Revelation 4 and 5 and those thrones, Revelation 20 and verse 1, speak of the throne of glory, and is to be understood of the judgment of Christ to be brought upon the treacherous, rebellious, wicked Jewish people. We meet with very frequent mention of the coming of Christ in his glory in this sense. Now again, that was quotations of John Lightfoot in the 17th century, with the exception of Kenneth Gentry's comment regarding John Lightfoot. But Stephen says why this there would be shades of this going on if this had been true. This just could not be true because this was only invented back in the 1960s. But maybe for Stephen this is not old enough. So let's go back a little further, Stephen. Let's go back to Chrysostom, who wrote in about 380 AD. He said this: remembering this saving commandment and all those things which came to pass for us. Now let me read that again. Remembering this saving commandment and all those things which came to pass for us, the cross, the grave, the resurrection on the third day, the ascension into heaven, the sitting down at the right hand, the second and glorious coming again. Did you hear that? Let me read that again one more time. This is Chrysostom in about 380 AD. Remembering this saving commandment and all those things which came to pass for us, the cross, the grave, the resurrection on the third day, the ascension into heaven, the sitting down at the right hand, the second and glorious coming again. But now, Stephen would have you to believe that this wasn't invented until the 1960s, and that if this were true, that you'd think there would have been shades of this going on ever since the beginning of the church. Well, maybe this is not old enough for Stephen. Let's go back a little further, Stephen. Let's go back to 160 AD. And we find that Tertullian writes, for Daniel says that both the holy city and the holy place are exterminated together with the coming leader, and that the pinnacle is destroyed into ruin. And so the times of the coming Christ, the leader, must be inquired into, which we shall trace in Daniel, and after computing them shall prove him to become, even on the ground that the times prescribed, and of competent signs and operations of his, which matters we prove, again, on the ground of the consequences which were ever announced as to follow his advent, in order that we may believe all to have been as well fulfilled as foreseen. Did you catch that, Stephen? In order that we may believe all to have been as well fulfilled as foreseen. Well, maybe that's not old enough. Let's go back a little bit more. Let's go back to 150 AD. And Melito, however that's pronounced, Melito, he wrote this: it is I who give life to the dead. It is I who, and let me back up just a little bit. He says, who will contend against me? Let him stand before me. It is I who delivered the condemned. It is I who gave life to the dead. It is I who raised up the buried. Who will argue with me? It is I, says Christ, who destroyed death. It is I who triumphed over the enemy, and having trod down Hades and bound the strong man, and have snatched up mankind to the heights of heaven. But now you would think that if this were true, that if preterism were true, that there would have been shades of this going on ever since the beginning of the church. Maybe this is not old enough for Stephen. Let's go back up a little more. Let's go back to 100 AD. And in the Odes of Solomon, he writes, "In him I have acquired eyes, and have seen his holy day. The way of error I have left, and have walked towards him, and have received salvation from him without grudging. I have put on incorruption through his name, and have put off corruption by his grace. Death has been destroyed before my face, and Sheol hath been abolished by my word." But now you would think, if preterism were true, that there would have been shades of this going on since the beginning of the church. But you know, Stephen argued, and the sad thing is, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, but if I were, I'd bet a large sum of money that Stephen has read every one of these. But he wants to try to convince you that preterism wasn't invented until just the 1960s. Well, I think we have thoroughly confuted Stephen's objection here that preterism just can't be right because it was only invented in the 1960s. Okay? I think we have soundly put that objection to bed. So, stay tuned, folks, and we will address, Lord willing, the rest of his arguments in upcoming videos. Thank you so much for your time, and you have a blessed evening.